There are two absolute truths about me as a board gamer. One, I love good Euro games, mostly because they emphasize skill and strategy and individual development over luck and direct conflict. And two, I also love really good narratives in my games. Something that's fairly standard in most all the video games that I play, but not nearly as prevalent in Euro-style board games. So a lot of the times I find myself gravitating towards games that fall somewhere in the middle of these two things. Games with really strong Euro structures to them, but also have a fun, story-driven adventure for me to explore, and luck would have it that more and more publishers are making games that blend these two things together. And one series in particular, Pandemic Legacy from designers Matt Leacock and Rob Daviau, has done a really great job at merging these two elements, creating a trilogy of games that have provided fun and narrative-driven experiences where the game's outcome depends solely upon the skill of its players and the ability as a group to cooperate together effectively. And to my earlier point, all of this is accomplished within the confines of Euro-centric mechanisms that actually evolve through the course of each of the Pandemic Legacy's 12 or more games, continually inviting players to be creative on how they choose to develop and play their characters in order to best tackle many of the game's challenges. So in today's very short, non-spoiler review of Pandemic Legacy Season 0, I'll be going straight to the point by letting you know exactly where this game ranks in comparison to the previous two seasons. So please sit back and relax as I review Pandemic Legacy Season 0. Now to begin, there are a couple things that I wanted to mention about Pandemic to sort of ground my thoughts on the series and give you an even better perspective on how I both approach playing the game and reviewing it. First, this was my very first experience playing Pandemic Legacy entirely solo. And although I chose to play the game alone, I did control two different characters at the same time for the entirety of the campaign. Now, there's a couple reasons for me deciding to do this, but mostly because we are in fact in the midst of a real-life pandemic itself with COVID-19. And my wife, who has been my go-to gaming partner for both of the previous Legacy seasons, has had to limit our game time together due to our conflicting work schedules, as well as the schedules of our children who are themselves in the midst of school and dance and other activities. So a lengthy campaign game that would honestly have taken us months to complete together was far more likely for me to complete entirely by myself. And I really don't think that the experience for me personally was diminished by approaching the game in this particular way. And just like my Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion solo playthrough, playing Season 0, if anything, showed me that these games can in fact be played by a single player controlling the decisions of two different characters at once, with no repercussions to the experience at all. Now, I most definitely would have enjoyed playing the game with a second player, but it can be played solo if you find yourself in a similar situation, and I don't believe you will have a lesser experience because of it. Second, I want people to also understand that I'm not the biggest fan of Pandemic, nor own a Pandemic game outside of these three Legacy games that I've now played from start to finish. Now, the reason I'm even mentioning this at all isn't because I want people to believe that I don't like Pandemic, which simply isn't the case. It's really just to let people know that if you are at all like me and aren't a huge fan of this series of games, please don't let that be your barrier of entry into this incredible trilogy of titles. Yes, the prospect of having to play 12 or more games of Pandemic back to back to back can absolutely seem overwhelming if you aren't already in love with that core system of gameplay from the original game. But in saying that, I can also attest to the fact that these Legacy games are really good and different and unique in the way that they allow players to invest a little bit of themselves into the characters that they become by allowing a lot of agency over how you build out your persona, how you play them, and how your role fits into that team dynamic, which does a fantastic job of resonating throughout the entire campaign and breathes a lot of life into making the whole experience really worth your time. So to summarize that point, whether you played Pandemic before and loved it or were just sort of lukewarm about it, any reservations that you may have should absolutely be thrown aside because they are really locking you out of a very fun and enjoyable series of games. 3. This has been a point of argument on a couple online forums. What I'm seeing is that the theme for which this season is anchored has angered some gamers who have taken to review bombing the game on various sites based solely on the fact that the game centers around the Cold War era, and not at all based on their actual experience playing the game. And I would ask you as you watch this video to absolutely make that decision by yourself. That's completely your right to do so. But also please recognize that my review here today is based solely on my experience with the game's mechanisms and its ability to deliver a strong legacy narrative throughout the campaign, not to debate the merits of the game's theme, so please take that into consideration as well. And finally, 4. As the title implies, this is a legacy game. The third in the series, in fact, and with it comes just as many secrets and features, and like any good legacy game, there are a multitude of boxes to open, secret doors to reveal, and choices to be made that will directly influence the narrative of your story according to your successes and your failures as a team. And with any legacy game comes the possibility of me spoiling too little or too much of what's in store for you. So I will choose to keep this review strictly to my overall thoughts so that you too can experience the game with completely virgin eyes. In fact, I'm not even going to go into the overall mechanisms of play here, mostly because if you've played Pandemic or any of the previous legacy seasons, then you should already be right at home with how this traditionally plays out. Not to mention that there are already plenty of how to play videos online, as well as a full set of rules if you want to know more about how to actually play the game. In other words, this is my way of keeping almost everything completely a mystery for you to discover. Okay, so it's been well over a month now since I've actually finished my campaign. And I've purposely given myself plenty of time to film this review in hopes that I could really distance myself from the game, mostly to make sure that my final judgment wasn't based on any trigger emotions that I may have had due to completing the story, either for good or for bad. And completing it is exactly what I did, finishing my final game of the campaign in roughly 18 hours, which encapsulated 14 total games, having to repeat just 2 of the months due to curveballs that the game threw at me. And looking back at the logs of our previous 2 seasons, this was a fairly noticeable difference, at least in comparison to the difficulty that came with Seasons 1 and Seasons 2. Now, I don't know how these results are going to stack up against others who've also had the chance to play through the entire campaign, but the game felt just a little bit less chaotic. And that may simply be attributed to the fact that I am now far better equipped mentally on how to best approach bad situations on the board, now that I have literally dozens of Pandemic Legacy games under my belt. But I also kind of assume that some of these new mechanisms that are added here just allow players to swivel a lot faster than they were able to do so in the previous seasons. And I don't think that is a bad thing at all. I just found myself at times better suited to handle more of what the game is throwing at me than I was able to do so in the past. And like all Pandemic games that came before, you're going to be spending a lot of your time doing just that, swiveling, as there are always new situations that will need your immediate attention. And I really enjoy that part of the game, especially since Season 0 does plenty of new things to make this constant stream of threats feel really fresh and really new. So now that you know that I've given myself plenty of time to formulate my opinion, the game has now kind of fallen into place organically, and I feel very confident in my ability to rank Season 0 in comparison to the other 2 games in the series, because honestly, that's what everyone here wants to know. Is the game good? Do I need to play it, and where do I place it in comparison to those 2 other games? And well, here's my answer. Is Season 0 a must-play game? Yes, it's absolutely worth playing, especially if you've already played through both of the previous 2 seasons. Being that the story here is in fact a prelude, it's actually a really great starting point for new players, but also does a really good job of setting up the origin of this virus and tying it into the ongoing lore that was both told and established with the narratives of Season 1 and Season 2. And on a purely mechanical side, it also does a very good job at providing enough differences in the gameplay to make this one feel familiar, yet entirely fresh in comparison. There's some really cool things going on with this gameplay in Season 0, and you can just tell that these 2 designers are purposefully stretching the design space and trying to experiment with new concepts that open up the game in some very unique ways. And these interesting new challenges constantly force the players to rethink the way in which they approach the game, from which characters to use in specific situations, to which cards to hold back in their hand in order to bypass security measures on the board. And that cryptic speech will become far more apparent when you actually play the game. But the point is, expect to be challenged in very new and different ways from the ways that you have in the past. So how would I rank it overall? Well, I think Season 0 falls squarely in the middle of these three games, with Season 2 being the absolute pinnacle of the series, and Season 0 falling right in the middle of that order. And although there is a tremendous amount of discovery to be found throughout all of Season 0, Season 2 is just a more magical experience, especially due to the incredible sense of scale and adventure and revelation as you are literally building out the map as you play with the use of stickers. And the story meets its dramatic conclusion. Season 2's ability to put you as a player into an almost completely unknown, desolate landscape invokes a sense of adventure that would be hard to replicate with these two other seasons, as they both come chronologically before it. And the emotions that come from discovering how the human race responds to a major viral outbreak is such a dramatic backdrop to a game that is almost impossible or even unfair to rightfully compare to the other two games. It's just far more epic in scale, and quite honestly resonates even more now in our current environment than it did back in 2017. Now, having said that, Season 2's place in my personal ranking doesn't diminish either of these two games. It just makes them a little less grandiose in scale for me personally. I really enjoyed my time with Season 0, and although it never comes close to reaching the narrative levels of Season 2, it's a far better, more interesting game mechanically than Season 1, and introduces some really novel ideas that I am sure will be built upon with future plans if the designers want to carry out the season. So to summarize, Season 0 feels right at home in this series of legacy games. It does more than enough to distinguish itself from the other titles, including setting up the story of how the virus came to be, and ultimately tying together the original story into the narratives that took place in Season 1 and Season 2. So that is my review of Pandemic Legacy Season 0. Whether you agree or you disagree, please make your comments below. Let us know what you think. And as always, thanks for watching. Hey everyone, if you guys enjoyed this video, please consider dinging the old bell below. That is going to help notify you of new videos that are uploaded to our channel. And as always, give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and please consider watching all of our videos, one of which you can see right here to my left.